Moving to Wales was supposed to be the fresh start we'd been dreaming about. A slower life, a safer life, a simpler life. And in many ways, it became exactly that. But there were also things nobody warned us about. Not the kind of things you find in relocation guides, not the things people show in YouTube travel videos. Because behind the breathtaking coastlines, the charming villages, and the endless green landscapes, there were realities we only discovered after we arrived. Realities that quietly changed the way we experienced life here. What happens when the excitement of moving abroad begins to fade? When the holiday feeling disappears and the real life begins? Because that's when Wales started revealing a side of itself we never expected. Before moving here, we imagined everything most people imagine. Long coastal walks, friendly communities, lower living costs, a peaceful escape from the pressure and pace of city life. And honestly, much of that turned out to be true. The beauty is real, the kindness is real, the slower pace of life is real. But so are the challenges. The isolation, the endless grey winter days, the dependence on transport, and the unexpected feeling of being both welcomed and completely out of place at the same time. When we moved to Aberystwyth, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter. A new country, new opportunities, a chance to build a different kind of life. As Africans moving to Wales, we knew there would be cultural differences. What we didn't realize was how many of those differences would show up in the smallest moments, the everyday moments, the moments nobody talks about, the moments that slowly shape your experience of a place. And looking back now, they are the things we genuinely wish someone had told us before we packed our bags and moved here. Some of them surprised us. Some of them challenged us, and a few completely changed the way we see Wales today. So before you decide to move here, or even if you're simply curious about what life in Wales is really like, these are the things nobody tells you until you're already living them. One of the first things you learn after moving abroad is that freedom comes with fine print. When you're preparing to leave home, it's easy to focus on the exciting parts, the flights, the new city, the fresh start. But long before you discover your favorite coffee shop or your favorite coastal walk, there's something less exciting that quietly shapes almost every part of your life: your visa. And the strange thing is, most people don't think about it until it becomes a problem. For many international students, the visa feels like the ticket that gets you into the country. But once you arrive, you realize it's much more than that. It determines how many hours you're allowed to work, what opportunities you can pursue, how long you can stay, and sometimes even what future options remain available to you. I remember arriving with this feeling that everything would naturally fall into place once we settled in, that somehow life abroad would simply unfold. But immigration rules have a way of quietly sitting in the background, influencing decisions you haven't even made yet. And what surprised me most wasn't how complicated the rules were. It was how easy it would have been to misunderstand them. Living abroad opens doors, but every door comes with conditions. And learning to respect those conditions become one of the earliest lessons Wales taught us. Then there was something else we completely underestimated. And honestly, I'm almost embarrassed to admit it now. Before moving here, part of me viewed Wales through a very simple lens. A beautiful part of the UK. Different scenery, different landscapes, but essentially the same experience. I couldn't have been more wrong. Because the longer you stay here, the more you realize Wales isn't simply a place. It's an identity. You see it in the language, you hear it in the conversations, you feel it in the way communities protect their history and traditions. And nowhere was that more obvious than in everyday life. Road signs appeared in 2 languages. Place names that looked impossible to pronounce suddenly became familiar. Conversations would drift naturally between English and Welsh. At first, it felt unfamiliar. Then it became fascinating. And eventually, it became one of the things I appreciated most. Moving abroad teaches you something important. You don't truly understand a place by visiting it. You understand it by learning to respect it. And Wales rewarded that curiosity. The more we embraced its culture, instead of comparing it to somewhere else, the more connected we began to feel. But then came another reality nobody had prepared us for. Distance. Or more specifically, the way distance feels here. Back home, I thought I understood what it meant for somewhere to be nearby. Then I moved to Wales, and suddenly, places that looked close on a map felt much further away in real life. A train journey, a delayed connection, a missed bus, a few hours disappearing unexpectedly. Simple journeys suddenly required planning, and nowhere was this more noticeable than living in Aberystwyth. It's one of the most beautiful places we've ever lived. Peaceful, scenic, almost cinematic at times, but beauty and isolation often live side by side. And that's something you don't fully appreciate until you've experienced it yourself. At first, the quiet felt calming, a welcome escape from noise and pressure. But during the darker months, when the days became shorter and home felt very far away, that same quietness started to feel different, almost emotional. There were moments when visiting friends, traveling to airports, or attending events felt like much bigger undertakings than expected. And looking back, I realized I wasn't just adjusting to a new country. I was adjusting to a completely different relationship with time, space, and distance. Which brings me to perhaps the most Welsh lesson of all: the weather. Now, I thought I understood rain. I really did. Then I moved to Aberystwyth and discovered there are levels to rain. Because here, rain doesn't simply fall. Sometimes it feels like it attacks from every direction at once. The wind carries it sideways, upwards, somehow, even underneath your umbrella. And it didn't take long to learn a lesson every local already knew. Water resistant is not waterproof. What seemed like a small detail quickly became one of the most important purchases we ever made: a proper waterproof jacket, good footwear, layers, lots of layers. Not because it makes the weather disappear, but because it changes your relationship with it. But the biggest surprise wasn't getting wet. It was discovering what months of grey skies can do to your mind, especially when you've grown up somewhere filled with sunlight. Nobody really tells you that weather isn't just something you experience physically. You experience it emotionally too. The shorter days, the lack of sunlight, the constant grey horizon. Little by little, it can affect your energy, your motivation, even your sense of optimism. And as an immigrant thousands of miles from home, those feelings can sometimes feel stronger than expected. The adjustment isn't only about learning a new place. Sometimes it's about learning a new version of yourself, one that has to find warmth even when the sun doesn't appear. And strangely enough, that lesson would end up preparing us for many challenges that came next. And perhaps one of the most unexpected challenges wasn't the weather, or the distance, or even being far away from home. It was understanding people, not culturally, not emotionally, literally understanding what they were saying. Before moving to the UK, I assumed English was English. Simple. The same language, the same words, the same conversations. Then I arrived. What nobody really prepares you for is how dramatically accents can change within a relatively small area. A short journey can feel like stepping into a completely different version of the language. The pronunciation changes, the rhythm changes, even familiar words can sound completely unfamiliar. There were moments in those early months when I smiled politely, while desperately trying to piece together what someone had just said. And sometimes, I had to ask people to repeat themselves more than once. At first, it felt slightly embarrassing, like I was missing something obvious. But over time, I realized it was simply part of adapting, part of learning, part of becoming comfortable in a place that was still new. And then something interesting happens. Your ears begin to change. Gradually, without even noticing, conversations that once felt difficult suddenly become effortless. Voices that sounded unfamiliar become recognizable. And one day, you realize you've just followed an entire conversation that would have completely confused you when you first arrived. It's a small victory, but when you're building a life abroad, small victories matter. Of course, understanding people is one thing, actually getting to them is another. Because if Wales teaches you patience, public transport often becomes the classroom. And this was another lesson we learned very quickly. The experience of public transport here depends almost entirely on where you live. In larger cities, life without a car can feel perfectly manageable, but in smaller towns and rural communities, the reality can be very different. There were times when journeys that seemed simple on paper became surprisingly complicated. A missed connection, a cancelled service, an evening bus that simply didn't exist, and suddenly, a short trip required hours of planning. What I wish I'd understood before moving is that choosing where to live isn't just about finding a beautiful location. It's about understanding how that location functions on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Not when you're visiting, not when you're on holiday, but when life becomes routine. Because a place can be absolutely stunning and feel surprisingly isolated, especially if you work remotely, don't drive, or depend heavily on public transport. Beauty alone doesn't create connection. Accessibility matters too. And the longer we lived here, the more we realized that daily convenience shapes happiness far more than people often admit. Which leads to one of the most practical pieces of advice I could give anyone considering a move to Wales. Learn to drive if you can. Honestly, it might be one of the most valuable investments you make before arriving. Because in many parts of Wales, driving isn't just about convenience. It's freedom. It's the difference between wondering if you can go somewhere and simply deciding to go. The difference between feeling limited and feeling independent. What surprised me was how much larger Wales became once driving entered the picture. Hidden beaches, remote hiking trails, small villages, places public transport rarely reaches easily. Entire experiences suddenly became accessible. But there was another surprise. Learning to drive in the UK isn't necessarily easy. The system is structured, the standards are high, and passing the test requires real preparation. It's not something most people can casually do in a few weeks. Driving lessons can be expensive, test availability can be frustrating, and the process often takes much longer than people expect. Looking back, it's something I wish I had planned for earlier, because once you're already balancing studies, work, finances, and settling into a new country, adding driving lessons into the mix can feel like another full-time commitment. And speaking of expectation versus reality, let's talk about housing. because this is where Wales can seem almost too good to be true. One of the first things that attracts people here is affordability. Compared to many parts of England, the difference can be striking. More space, beautiful gardens, beautiful surroundings, and homes that often appear slightly cheaper. When you're searching online, it can feel like you've discovered a hidden secret, a place where your money suddenly stretches much further. And to some extent, that's true. But every bargain has a story, and sometimes that story only reveals itself after you've moved in. What looks perfect during a sunny viewing can feel different during a Welsh winter. That's when you begin to notice things. The cold corners of the room, the condensation on the windows, the heating that works much harder than expected, the hidden costs nobody mentioned. One of the things I wish I'd paid closer attention to wasn't just the rent or the purchase price. It was how comfortable the home would actually be to live in. Because affordability isn't just what you pay to get the keys. It's about what it costs to stay warm, to stay dry, to stay comfortable, especially when winter arrives. Looking back, I've realized something interesting about moving abroad. The biggest lessons rarely come from major life events. They come from ordinary things, conversations, bus journeys, weather, housing, small daily realities that slowly shape your experience without you even noticing. And Wales has a way of teaching those lessons quietly, one day at a time. And there were still a few lessons we hadn't learned yet. And eventually, after the excitement of moving settles, after you've learned the roads, adjusted to the weather, and figured out your daily routines, a different kind of challenge appears. One that's much harder to prepare for. Homesickness. The funny thing about missing home is that it rarely arrives in dramatic ways. It sneaks up on you. A familiar song, a conversation, a smell, or sometimes a meal. And that's exactly how it happened to me. There would be random evenings when I suddenly craved food from home. Not because I was hungry, but because I missed familiarity. I missed comfort. I missed something that reminded me where I came from. In larger cities, you can often find restaurants that offer a taste of home, but in smaller towns, those options can be limited. And even when you find them, something is usually missing. The flavor, the memory, the feeling attached to it. That's when I realized something I wish I'd understood before moving. Learning to cook isn't just a practical skill, it's an emotional one. Because over time, my kitchen became more than a place to make food. It became a connection to home. A place where familiar smells could instantly transport me thousands of miles away. And on difficult days, that mattered more than I expected. What's interesting about living abroad isn't that independence arrives in ways you never anticipate. Not through grand achievements, but through small inconveniences. Things you never thought twice about before suddenly require planning. Simple routines, haircuts, personal grooming, maintaining yourself. Back home, these things felt effortless. You knew where to go, who to call, what to expect. Then you move abroad and suddenly, the familiar system disappears. In larger cities, solutions are usually available. But in smaller communities, finding services that match your needs can sometimes be surprisingly difficult, or expensive, or both. And little by little, you start learning how to do things for yourself. Not necessarily because you want to, but because it becomes the practical choice. What living abroad teaches you is resourcefulness. You become your own problem solver, your own support system, your own backup plan. And while that can feel frustrating at first, it's also where a lot of personal growth happens. But perhaps the biggest reality check for many people moving abroad isn't loneliness or weather or cultural adjustment. It's money. Because no matter how beautiful a place is, life still comes with bills. And those bills have a way of arriving every month, whether you're ready or not. Before moving, it's easy to focus on the big expenses: tuition, rent, flights, the obvious costs. What catches many people off guard are the smaller ones, the everyday expenses that quietly accumulate in the background. A train ticket here, heating costs there, groceries, phone bills, unexpected purchases. Small amounts that don't feel significant individually until the end of the month arrives. One thing I learned very quickly is that financial organization creates the kind of freedom that people rarely talk about. Not luxury, not wealth, peace. Because when your finances are under control, your mind becomes lighter. You worry less, you sleep better, you can focus on building your life instead of constantly reacting to problems. And honestly, that peace of mind is worth far more than people realize. But if there's one lesson that sits behind almost every other lesson in this journey, it's this: skills matter. When you move abroad, something interesting happens. Many of the labels that once defined people begin to fade in the background. Where you're from, what school you attended, who you know, those things still matter. But increasingly, another question becomes more important. What can you actually do? Because the reality of building a life in a new country often comes down to value. The skills you bring, the problems you can solve, the experience you've developed, and the confidence that comes from knowing you have something useful to offer. One of the most reassuring discoveries I made after moving was that skills travel surprisingly well. A valuable skill doesn't care about borders. It doesn't care where you're born. It doesn't care about your accent. It creates opportunities, options, flexibility, and perhaps most importantly, a sense of security. Looking back now, I don't see skills simply as career assets. I see them as a form of stability, something you can carry with you no matter where life takes you, because when everything around you is changing, the skills you've invested in become one of the few things that remain constant. And the longer we lived in Wales, the more we realized that moving abroad wasn't just teaching us about a new country, it was teaching us about ourselves. And some of the most important lessons were still waiting for us ahead. But perhaps the lesson nobody prepares you for is what moving abroad does to your relationships. Not because anyone does anything wrong, not because there's a dramatic falling out, but because life keeps moving, even when you're thousands of miles away. One of the hardest truths I've had to accept was that distance changes people, sometimes slowly, sometimes so gradually that you barely notice it happening. Conversations become less frequent, messages take longer to arrive, the updates that once felt automatic become occasional, and before you realize it, certain relationships no longer look the way they used to. At first, they can feel painful. You start wondering whether people have forgotten about you, whether you've drifted apart, whether moving away changed something. But over time, I began to understand something important. Distance doesn't create new realities. It often reveals existing ones. Because the people who genuinely value your presence usually find a way to stay connected. And at the same time, you begin changing too. Your routines change, your priorities change, your perspective changes. The version of you that left home is not always the same version that returns, and not every relationship evolves alongside that journey. Sometimes, growth creates connection. Sometimes it creates distance, and learning to accept both is part of living abroad. Of course, those moments of distance can sometimes lead to another feeling: loneliness. And loneliness is a strange thing. It doesn't always arrive when you're physically alone. Sometimes it appears in crowded places, sometimes during celebrations, sometimes on ordinary afternoons when you suddenly realize how far away home really is. When I first moved here, I thought loneliness would be something dramatic, something obvious, but often it was much quieter than that. A feeling, a moment, a reminder that I was building a life far away from everything familiar. But Wales taught me something unexpected. Community matters more than proximity. Because while loneliness can appear anywhere, belonging has to be built. And in places like Aberystwyth, belonging often begins with small actions: showing up, returning, becoming familiar, saying hello, supporting local businesses, attending events, joining conversations, learning the stories behind the place you now call home. What surprised me most wasn't how welcoming people were. It was how intentional I had to be. In larger cities, connections sometimes happen automatically. In smaller towns, you often have to take the first step. But once those connections begin to form, something shifts. The place feels different, the streets feel different, the town stops feeling like somewhere you're staying and starts feeling like somewhere you belong. And that brings me to Aberystwyth itself, because after everything, the weather, the distance, the adjustments, the loneliness, the learning curve, there's a reason we've stayed. At first, Aberystwyth felt almost too quiet. Coming from busier environments, the stillness was impossible to ignore. There were moments when I wondered if life here might be too slow, too remote, too far removed from everything. But something interesting happens when you stay long enough. The quiet stops feeling empty and starts feeling valuable. You begin to notice things you would have rushed past before. The changing colors of the sea, the rhythm of the tides, the sunset that somehow never looks exactly the same twice. The comfort of recognizing familiar faces around town, the simple luxury of having space to think, and gradually, the beauty stops being something you visit. It becomes part of your everyday life. That doesn't mean life here is perfect. Far from it. There are trade-offs. Fewer opportunities in some industries, longer journeys, limited services, moments when isolation feels very real. But living somewhere isn't just about finding perfection. It's about finding a place that fits the life you want to build. And that lesson took me much longer to understand than I expected. Because the truth is, moving abroad is never only about geography. It's never just about changing countries or cities or postcodes. It's about transformation. Looking back now, I can see that Wales changed me in ways I never anticipated. Not dramatically, not overnight, quietly, gradually, one day at a time. The storms taught patience, the distance taught perspective, the challenges taught resilience, the community taught belonging, and somewhere between the sea and the mountains and the silence, the place slowly became part of who I am. Which might be the most surprising thing about moving abroad. You begin the journey thinking you've discovered a new place, but eventually, you realize you're also discovering a new version of yourself, a version shaped by unfamiliar experiences, unexpected challenges, and moments you never could have planned for. So if you're thinking about moving to Wales or moving abroad anywhere in the world, prepare for the practical things, the visas, the housing, the transport, the finances. Those things matter. But don't forget to prepare for the parts nobody talks about, the emotional adjustments, the identity shifts, the relationships that evolve, the resilience you'll have to build, because beyond all the logistics, that's where the real journey happens. And sometimes, the places that change your life the most are the places you never fully expect to call home. This is Travel and Tales.